Have you ever come home from a social event feeling completely drained, even if nothing bad happened? The conversations were fine, the people were friendly, everything seemed normal, and yet, by the time you get home, your energy feels completely gone. You sit down, the room finally becomes quiet, and slowly, something interesting happens. Your mind starts to settle, your body relaxes, and after a little while, you actually begin to feel better, almost recharged. But this raises a fascinating question. Why does spending time alone give some people energy, while for others, being alone feels uncomfortable, even lonely? For a long time, society has had a very simple explanation for this. If someone enjoys being alone, people assume something must be wrong. Maybe they lack social skills. Maybe they're shy. Maybe they're antisocial. In some cases, solitude is even treated like a problem that needs to be fixed, as if enjoying time alone means you're somehow disconnected from the world. But in recent years, neuroscience has begun to suggest something quite different. The experience of solitude may not be a weakness at all. In fact, for some people, the brain may actually function better in quieter environments, which means the real difference may not be personality, but how the brain processes stimulation. To understand this difference, we need to look at a particular part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. This region sits right behind your forehead, and it plays a crucial role in how we think. It's involved in things like self-reflection, decision-making, and complex problem-solving. Whenever you pause to think about your life, evaluate a situation, or consider different possibilities, the prefrontal cortex is hard at work. But this part of the brain is very sensitive to noise. Not just physical noise, mental noise. Conversations, social signals, expectations, constant interaction. All of these compete for the brain's attention, and in highly stimulating environments, the prefrontal cortex can become overwhelmed. One way to imagine this is to picture a busy highway during rush hour. Cars everywhere, movement in every direction, traffic slowing down because there's simply too much activity. Now imagine that same highway late at night, almost empty. Suddenly, movement becomes smooth. Ideas travel further without interruption. For some people, this is what happens when they spend time alone. With fewer distractions to process, the brain finally has space to think. Which leads to an interesting question. What exactly happens inside the mind when the noise disappears? So if the brain processes information differently in quiet environments, the next question becomes even more interesting. Where does the feeling of energy actually come from? Part of the answer lies in brain chemistry. Inside the brain, different chemical systems regulate how we experience motivation, attention, and reward. Two of these systems play an important role here. The first is the dopamine system. Dopamine is often associated with excitement, novelty, and stimulation. It's active when we encounter something new, meeting new people, exploring unfamiliar environments, experiencing fast-paced social interaction. For many people, these experiences feel energizing because dopamine levels increase. But the brain has another system as well, one that receives far less attention, the acetylcholine system. This system is associated with calm focus, deep thinking, and a quieter kind of mental satisfaction. Instead of chasing stimulation, this system becomes active when the brain settles into concentration, reading a book, reflecting on ideas, sitting quietly with a cup of tea, letting thoughts unfold slowly. And this leads to a fascinating realization. Some brains respond more strongly to the excitement of dopamine, but others respond more strongly to the calm focus created by acetylcholine. Which means something important. If you feel restored during quiet moments, it may not mean you're antisocial. It may simply mean your brain runs on a different kind of fuel. And when that fuel is present, the mind begins to operate in a very different way. But there's another fascinating shift that happens when the brain becomes quiet. It has to do with something called brainwave states. Your brain operates at different rhythms depending on what you're doing. When you're actively engaged in conversation, making quick decisions, or processing a lot of information, the brain tends to operate in what scientists call the beta state. This is the fast, alert mode of the brain. It's useful for navigating social situations and responding quickly to the world around you. But it's not always the best state for deeper thinking. When the environment becomes quieter, the brain often shifts into a different rhythm, the alpha state. This state appears when the mind relaxes slightly. You're still awake, still aware, but the mental pressure begins to ease. And if the mind continues to settle, the brain can move even deeper into what researchers call the theta state. This is where something interesting begins to happen. Studies on creativity suggest that many sudden insights appear when the brain enters these slower states, alpha, theta, moments when the mind is not overloaded with external input. Think about when ideas often appear: during a quiet walk, in the shower, while staring out the window, times when you're not actively trying to solve anything, which raises an intriguing question. Why do some of our best ideas appear when we seem to be doing nothing? One explanation is surprisingly simple. When the brain is no longer busy reacting to constant stimulation, it finally has space to connect ideas. And those connections can lead to insights that rarely appear in a noisy, crowded mind. Throughout history, many great thinkers seem to share a similar habit. They spent long periods of time alone. Albert Einstein often took solitary walks while thinking through his ideas. Isaac Newton developed some of his most important insights while working in isolation. Nikola Tesla was known for long hours of quiet concentration. Charles Darwin spent years reflecting, observing, and thinking before publishing his theory of evolution. At first glance, this might seem like a coincidence. But when you look closer, a pattern begins to appear. These thinkers weren't simply avoiding people. They were creating something far more valuable: space. Mental space. The kind of space where complex ideas can slowly take shape, where the mind can explore possibilities without constant interruption. In other words, solitude doesn't just remove distractions. It creates the conditions where deeper thinking becomes possible. And when that kind of thinking begins, something interesting starts to happen inside the brain. Another common misunderstanding about people who enjoy solitude is that they're avoiding social life altogether. But that's rarely the case. Many people who value time alone still care deeply about relationships. They simply approach social interaction differently. Instead of spreading their attention across many connections, they tend to be more selective. Psychologists sometimes describe this as selective socialization. Rather than seeking constant interaction, these individuals prefer fewer conversations, but more meaningful ones. You can think of it like two different social styles. One style is broad and expansive, lots of people, frequent interactions, many short conversations. The other style is more focused, fewer people, but deeper connections, stronger conversations. A simple analogy might help. Some social networks function like a convenience store, open to everyone, constant activity, people coming and going. Others function more like a private club, smaller, more selective, but often more intimate. And this leads to an important realization. Enjoying solitude doesn't necessarily mean wanting less connection. Sometimes it simply means being more intentional about the connections that matter. There's also a physiological effect that researchers have started to observe. Periods of quiet can actually help regulate the brain's stress system. In many studies, time spent in calm, low-stimulation environments has been linked to lower cortisol levels. Cortisol is one of the primary hormones associated with stress. When it stays elevated for long periods, the mind becomes restless, thoughts race, emotions feel louder, everything seems more overwhelming. But when the brain spends time in a quieter environment, something different begins to happen. The nervous system gradually slows down. Mental noise begins to fade. Emotional signals become easier to process. In a sense, the brain starts clearing out the background static, which leads to an interesting way of thinking about solitude. Rather than being a withdrawal from life, quiet time may function more like a reset system for the mind, a chance for the brain to recalibrate after constant stimulation. And that raises another question. What happens when the brain receives this kind of reset on a regular basis? When the brain regularly experiences these quiet resets, another interesting advantage can begin to appear. People who spend time alone often develop a slightly different relationship with their thoughts. Instead of constantly reacting to everything happening around them, they gain a bit of distance, and that distance can change how they see situations. In highly social environments, emotions tend to spread quickly. Stress spreads, excitement spreads, panic spreads. It's easy to get pulled into the emotional current of the crowd. But when someone regularly steps away from that environment, the brain has more time to observe rather than react. One way to picture this is with a simple analogy. Imagine a group of people standing in heavy fog. When you're inside the fog, it's hard to see clearly. Everything feels confusing. But someone standing on a hill above the fog sees the entire landscape, the same environment, but a very different perspective. In many ways, time spent alone allows the brain to step slightly above the fog of constant social noise. And from that distance, something powerful becomes possible: clarity. Because sometimes, a small amount of distance is exactly what the mind needs in order to see things more clearly. So when we look at the bigger picture, a different story about solitude begins to emerge. When the brain experiences fewer distractions, it often processes information more deeply. Ideas have more room to develop. Thoughts have time to connect. The mind becomes less reactive and more reflective. At the same time, different chemical systems inside the brain can become active. For some people, calm focus is more energizing than constant stimulation, which means quiet environments may actually support how their brain naturally works. We also see shifts in brainwave activity. When the mind moves away from the fast pace of constant interaction, it can enter slower states like alpha and theta. These are the states where many creative insights appear, moments when ideas suddenly come together. And socially, solitude doesn't necessarily lead to isolation. In many cases, it leads to a different strategy: fewer interactions, but deeper ones, more intentional connections instead of constant conversation. When you combine all of this, a surprising perspective appears. Enjoying solitude may not be a sign of weakness at all. In a world that is constantly noisy, fast, and overstimulating, the ability to step back, slow down, and think clearly may actually be a cognitive advantage. So if you've ever noticed that quiet moments seem to restore your energy, you're not strange, and you're certainly not alone. For some people, the brain simply works best when the environment becomes calm enough to think clearly. And if you've ever experienced a moment when stepping away from the noise helped you understand something better, I'd be curious to hear about it. What was a time when being alone actually helped you see something more clearly? Feel free to share your experience in the comments.